On the 13th of April, 2000, Boris Natanovich Pasternak, the head of the publishing house Polyfact, was heading to the Moscow suburb of Podolsk for the second time, haunted by a suffocating sense of impending doom. Just a day earlier, his attempt to clarify the situation at the 3rd City Police Station had ended in failure. The duty officers flatly refused to authorize the opening of the apartment belonging to a 76-year-old scholar who had not been heard from in 3 weeks. But on this day, the publisher was determined to go all the way. He was alarmed by the long and strange silence of the man with whom he was supposed to discuss the publication of a potentially scandalous new book about Stalin. Do you know what happens when intuition screams of danger? When the task force finally managed to force the locks of the apartment on the 4th floor of building number 1 on Oktyabrski Avenue, a suffocating stench of decomposition hit their nostrils. In the dim corridor, dark patches of long-dried blood were visible, and clear drag marks pointed the way to the bedroom. There, in a huge brown pool of congealed liquid, lay the body of a man whose name was known to nearly everyone in the country. William Vasilyevich Pokhlyobkin, a celebrated historian and culinary expert, author of a monumental study on the history of vodka, and the creator of 50 books with a total circulation of 100 million copies, was dead. What if I told you that even the most experienced investigators were shaken by what they saw? Crime scene. The sight that greeted the investigators shocked them with its brutality. Fat green flies swarmed over the decomposing body. The gas oven had been left burning continuously for 2 weeks, and only by sheer luck had this not led to a massive explosion that could have destroyed the entire stairwell. The victim was dressed in a strict black suit and tie, his formal attire, which he usually wore when traveling to Moscow for important business meetings. Later, the forensic expert would record 11 stab wounds, inflicted presumably with a screwdriver or sharpened tool, and conclude that death resulted from massive blood loss. But are you ready to hear the most shocking detail of this case? The conclusion of the forensic examination left everyone in shock. The victim's blood contained an amount of alcohol equivalent to half a liter of the strongest spirits. For anyone even slightly familiar with Pokhlyobkin, this sounded like complete nonsense. The man who had written the History of Vodka, a scholar who studied Russia's alcohol culture on an academic level, was a staunch teetotaler and categorically abstained from drinking. It was said that in his entire long life, he had consumed no more than a single tiny shot. This meant either that the killer had forcibly made his victim drink, or that they were dealing with a sadistic and cynical ritual. Here is what no one will tell you about the crime scene. The theory of a simple robbery was dismissed immediately. The state of the apartment completely ruled it out. Expensive furniture, paintings, a collection of exquisite Chinese porcelain valued at $1,000, all remained untouched. Inside the safe, cash and other valuables were still in place. Yet every room was in complete disarray. The table was overturned, bundles of old newspapers were scattered on the floor, the drawers of the wardrobe were pulled out, and clothes were dumped in messy piles. The perpetrator was clearly searching for something, but material gain was definitely not the goal. According to the official statement of the Moscow Region Main Directorate of Internal Affairs, there were no obvious signs of forced entry or theft. This pointed to only one conclusion. The killer had been let into the apartment voluntarily. However, for those who knew the scholar's character, such an assumption seemed utterly implausible. Pokhlyobkin was an extremely cautious man, distrustful to the point of pathology. He had reached the point where he would not even open the door to the postman. In the final years of his life, he led the existence of a true recluse, terrified of leaving the confines of his home. The only person with whom the historian maintained a close relationship was his neighbor Ivan Staronenkov, but he had died shortly before these tragic events. With all other neighbors, Pokhlyobkin remained consistently polite, but kept no contact. The circle of people he trusted enough to open the door to was extremely narrow. So who managed to enter this suspicious old man's home, and why did they find it necessary to kill him? The evidence found at the crime scene was extremely scarce and raised more questions than it answered. A footprint of a man's size 46 shoe was left on the scattered books. Nearby lay a cigarette butt from a cheap Bellamore papyrosa, something Pokhlyobkin himself had never smoked in his life. And perhaps the most symbolic and ominous detail of all, the same boot print was stamped right on a copy of his final book, The Great Pseudonym, which was devoted to Stalin's biography. It was as if the killer had deliberately trampled on the scholar's last work, leaving an unambiguous message. Case without a suspect. On the 13th of April, 2000, a criminal case numbered 54,264 was opened upon discovery of the body. At first, the investigation was conducted quite actively, but very soon it hit a dead end. All standard theories, from a domestic quarrel to a robbery, collapsed under the very first check. On the 22nd of October, 2001, the case was officially suspended due to the impossibility of identifying a person to be charged. The murder of one of the most famous scholars of modern Russia remains unsolved to this day. But to understand who might have wanted the death of the country's leading expert on Russian gastronomy, we must travel back into the past. We must return to the 20th of August, 1923, when a boy was born in Moscow, a boy destined to become one of the most controversial and influential researchers of his era. At birth, he was given the name William August. The first was in honor of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the second in honor of the prominent figure of German social democracy, August Bebel. This choice of names perfectly reflected the fiery revolutionary convictions of his father, who played a prominent role in the Bolshevik underground. The family bore the surname Pokhlyobkin, but it was not their ancestral name. It was a revolutionary pseudonym. The father's real name was Vasily Mikhailovich Mikhailov, an old Bolshevik and professional revolutionary who had chosen this conspiratorial alias in honor of his grandfather, a cook. Over time, the pseudonym became so entrenched that it completely replaced the real name, and the entire family became known as the Pokhlyobkins. Curiously, this detail of the biography seemed to symbolically foreshadow the son's future fascination with culinary history. In 1937, when 14-year-old William was preparing to enter the 8th grade, tragedy struck the family. Early one morning, the infamous black NKVD van pulled up to their house, and officers arrested Vasily Mikhailovich on fabricated charges of participating in an anti-Soviet terrorist organization. The old revolutionary, who had endured Tsarist prisons and exile, could not believe that the Soviet government, for which he had fought his entire life, had now declared him an enemy of the people. Are you ready to learn how this tragedy forever changed the boy? His father's arrest marked the beginning of a painful and premature coming of age for the teenager. Yesterday's friends instantly turned their backs on the family of a traitor. Neighbors began whispering behind their backs. Classmates started bullying him, calling him the son of an enemy of the people. His mother lost her job and barely scraped by with occasional earnings. The family was on the brink of survival. But the most difficult trial was not material hardship. It was the unbearable psychological pressure, the constant feeling of guilt for crimes never committed, and the daily need to prove loyalty to the regime. It was in these difficult years that the future scholar developed the traits that would define his entire destiny. the ability to work productively in complete isolation, a deep distrust of any official version of events, the need to get to the bottom of everything on his own, and an iron will in achieving his goals. The 14-year-old boy learned the main lesson of the Stalin era. Trust only facts and documents, for they are the only things that neither lie nor betray. At school, William demonstrated outstanding ability, finding in knowledge his only refuge from a hostile reality. He immersed himself in the study of history, languages, and literature. Foreign languages came to him with particular ease. By the time he graduated, he was already fluent in German, English, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Serbo-Croatian. This phenomenal linguistic talent would later open the doors of high diplomacy for him and help him become an exceptional researcher. But in the family archive, there was another, very special source of knowledge. It was an old cookbook that he had inherited from his great-grandfather, the cook. The yellowed volume became, for the boy, a window into a long-vanished world of Russian culture. Kundyumi, Solyanka, Tiuria, Kalia, Kulaga. These names sounded to him like magical incantations from a distant and mysterious past. His mother told him that this was the true Russian cuisine, the one that existed before the revolution and then vanished without a trace in time. Why had these dishes disappeared? What happened to the traditions that had formed over centuries? These questions would haunt Pokhlyobkin for the rest of his life. Even during his school years, that incredible meticulousness began to emerge. The very quality that would later allow him to revolutionize the understanding of the origins of national dishes. The teenager remembered the tiniest details, noticed every contradiction in adult stories, and stubbornly tried to grasp the logic behind historical events. When the official version of party history was taught in school, he mentally compared it with the fragments of memories he had heard at home before his father's arrest. These skills of critical analysis would prove invaluable when he, like a true detective, began to investigate the mysteries of the origins of Russian cuisine. The stark contrast between the richness of old recipes and the poverty of the Soviet cuisine of his day made an especially powerful impression on the young man. In the school cafeteria, they were fed tasteless porridge and watery soup. Store shelves were lined with monotonous canned goods, and the bread was gray and gummy. It created the strong impression that an entire gastronomic culture had been irretrievably lost in just a few decades. Why had this happened? Who had decided what the Soviet person was supposed to eat? And how could it be that a nation with a 1,000-year culinary tradition had so easily forgotten its great heritage? In 1940, 17-year-old William graduated from secondary school with honors. However, the path to the university for the son of an enemy of the people was completely closed. Higher education was not permitted for the children of the repressed. At best, the young man could hope for a working-class specialty or a place in a technical school. But June 22, 1941, changed everything. The Great Patriotic War began, which, paradoxically, opened up entirely new opportunities for him. Already in July, the 18-year-old went to the military enlistment office and applied to be enlisted as a volunteer in the active army. His decision to go to war was dictated not only by patriotic feelings, but also by a cold, rational calculation. William clearly understood that this was his only chance to wash away the stigma of his family's disgrace and earn the right to a normal, full life. Frontline soldiers were treated with special respect and honor in Soviet society. Their past no longer mattered. The war became the road to rehabilitation for the son of the repressed. In August 1941, Private Pokhlyobkin arrived at a military unit defending the approaches to Moscow. His excellent knowledge of the German language immediately made him an invaluable specialist. He participated in the interrogation of prisoners, translated captured enemy documents, and worked with reconnaissance groups. After suffering a severe concussion, the young soldier was transferred to service in the army kitchen, where he enthusiastically began to diversify the meager Red Army rations. Even in wartime conditions, William never stopped being passionately interested in culinary matters. He invented new ways of preparing canned goods, searched for edible plants that could enrich field rations with vitamins, and studied the specifics of nutrition in various climate conditions. At first, his comrades in arms laughed at this scholarly cook, but very soon they came to appreciate the results of his experiments. The frontline kitchen under his guidance became noticeably more varied and flavorful. The war turned out to be a harsh but highly effective school of life for the future researcher. 4 years in the trenches, the constant proximity of death, and the enormous responsibility for feeding his comrades in arms transformed the dreamy teenager into a strong-willed man, ready for absolutely any trial. His frontline experience taught him to work under unrelenting stress, to analyze contradictory information instantly, and to make the right decision even when critical data was lacking. These skills would prove invaluable in his future scholarly work. Letter to the Generals. In 1944, 21-year-old Sergeant Pokhlyobkin took a step that changed his entire destiny. He wrote a letter straight to the main political directorate of the Red Army with a bold request for permission to enter the university after the war. In his letter, he justified this request by pointing out the urgent need to train qualified personnel for the country's post-war reconstruction. The courage of this gesture is simply astonishing. An ordinary soldier dared to give advice to generals and put forward his own candidacy for education. And you know what? His calculation turned out to be absolutely correct. The political directorate highly appreciated the initiative of this educated and brave frontline soldier and, in January 1945, sent him for admission to the Faculty of International Relations at Moscow State University. For the son of an enemy of the people, this was nothing short of a miracle. The path to higher education and a respectable career, which had seemed permanently closed, suddenly opened. The war had truly become his road to rehabilitation and the beginning of an entirely new life. Thus ended the first, most tragic and difficult period in the biography of the future great scholar. The son of a repressed revolutionary, once an outcast of the Stalinist era, was transforming into a student of the most prestigious university in the country, a future diplomat and researcher. Childhood traumas, hunger, and the horrors of war were now behind him. But it was precisely those trials that tempered his character and forged the qualities that would make him an outstanding scholar. Ahead lay years of study, major scientific discoveries, worldwide fame, and a mysterious, terrifying death in a Podolsk apartment. The White Crow of MGIMO. On the 31st of January, 1945, 21-year-old veteran William Pokhlyobkin received his official papers confirming his admission to the Faculty of International Relations at Moscow State University. The letter from the main political directorate of the Red Army had arrived at the very moment when he had almost lost hope of being allowed to study. The young sergeant fully understood the significance of that moment. For the son of a repressed revolutionary, this was his only chance to break free from the vicious circle of social exclusion and gain a path into the world of serious scholarship. At that time, the Faculty of International Relations was truly a forge of the Soviet diplomatic elite, producing future ambassadors, intelligence officers, and leading foreign policy analysts. Here studied the children of high-ranking party officials, the heirs of famous diplomatic dynasties, and representatives of the national elites of the Soviet republics. Against this brilliant backdrop, the son of an enemy of the people stood out like a true white crow. But it was precisely this fact that compelled him to rise above everyone else. From his very first days of study, William astonished his professors with his phenomenal capacity for work and truly encyclopedic knowledge. His frontline experience had given him what his classmates from well-off families so sorely lacked: a deep understanding of the value of life, a sense of responsibility for every decision made, and the ability to work effectively under extreme conditions. The young man studied history, international law, economics, and philosophy with the same extraordinary persistence with which he had recently fought the enemy on the front lines. Foreign languages, in particular, came to him with striking ease. By the time he entered the institute, William was already fluent in German, English, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Serbo-Croatian. During his years of study, he added Italian and Finnish to this impressive list. Such an astonishing linguistic talent opened up the brightest prospects for a diplomatic career. But fate had very different plans for him. Even as a student, the defining trait of the future scholar revealed itself clearly: his total distrust of authority and irrepressible drive to figure everything out for himself. William did not simply memorize lectures for exams. He meticulously compared them with primary sources, hunted for the slightest contradictions, and formulated his own, sometimes daring, hypotheses. He was particularly irritated by attempts to present controversial and ambiguous questions as long-settled and unquestionable truths. This habit of critical thinking would later make him an outstanding researcher. In 5 years of study, Pokhlyobkin received only one grade that was not top marks. Good. It was a 4 on the state exam in Marxism-Leninism. This single 4 cost him his red diploma, but it vividly demonstrated the character of the future scholar. He categorically refused to mechanically memorize dogma, preferring to think for himself, even if it meant sacrificing formal achievements and career opportunities. The Scandinavianist. In 1949, Pokhlyobkin graduated from MGIMO and immediately entered postgraduate studies at the Institute of History of the USSR Academy of Sciences. His choice of academic specialization was dictated by purely pragmatic considerations. The Scandinavian countries were considered a secondary and not very prestigious direction in Soviet historiography. There were far fewer ideological constraints, and therefore far more opportunities for independent and original research. 3 years of postgraduate study became a period of intense intellectual growth for him. The young researcher spent days and nights in the archives, studying documents on the history of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, mastering advanced methods of historical analysis, and shaping his own unique research program. His academic advisor was astonished by the incredible thoroughness and conscientiousness of his graduate student, who double-checked every fact against several independent sources. In 1952, 29-year-old Pokhlyobkin brilliantly defended his candidate dissertation on the topic, "The Anti-People and Anti-National Policy of the Ruling Circles in Norway." On the eve of the Second World War, the work received the highest marks from leading experts and opened the door for the young scholar to a career as a professional historian. After defending his dissertation, Pokhlyobkin was appointed Junior Research Fellow in the Department of Contemporary History at the Institute of History of the USSR Academy of Sciences. He specialized in the foreign policy of the Scandinavian countries, studied the history of Russian-Scandinavian relations, and analyzed diplomatic documents. His colleagues quickly came to regard him as a conscientious researcher with highly original and independent thinking. Alongside his main work, the young scholar became inspired by the idea of creating his own academic journal. In 1955, he founded Scandinavian Collection. the first periodical in the Soviet Union, entirely devoted to the history of the Nordic countries. The journal was published in the city of Tartu, using the editor's own personal funds, financed from his modest fees for articles and translations. This was a completely unique precedent of private publishing initiative for Soviet science. Scandinavian collection quickly gained wide recognition among specialists, both in the USSR and abroad. It published translations of Scandinavian authors, articles by Soviet historians, and unique documentary materials from closed archives. The journal became a vital channel of scholarly exchange between the Soviet Union and the countries of Northern Europe, greatly contributing to the development of Scandinavian studies in Soviet scholarship. Over the 6 years of the journal's existence, Pokhlyobkin became one of the country's leading experts on the history of Northern Europe. And in 1955, an event occurred that radically changed the young historian's academic interests and the entire trajectory of his life. While working in the Stockholm archives on materials concerning Russo-Swedish relations of the 15th century, he accidentally came across astonishing documents. Swedish diplomats, in their reports, described in great detail the Moscow feasts, marveling at the incredible variety of Russian cuisine, the refinement of dish presentation, and the complexity of court culinary ceremonies. These accounts were completely at odds with the primitive notions of Russian cuisine that prevailed in Soviet scholarship. What had happened to these rich culinary traditions? Why had they vanished without a trace? How could a nation with a 1,000-year-old food culture have so easily forgotten its great heritage? This discovery became a turning point in the researcher's scientific biography. He realized that the history of cuisine could become a unique key to understanding many deep processes in the development of civilization. Through culinary traditions, one could study economics, trade, diplomacy, demography, and cultural contacts between nations. And most importantly, this was a virtually unexplored scientific field, a place where one could work without constantly glancing back at the frozen, unquestionable authorities of Soviet historiography. Free sailing. In the early 1960s, Pokhlyobkin began the systematic study of the history of Russian cuisine. He worked in the archives of ancient monasteries, studied old merchant ledgers, and analyzed cadastral documents where food supplies were meticulously recorded. He paid special attention to literary sources, finding in the works of classic writers priceless descriptions of feasts, mentions of long-forgotten dishes, and details of dining etiquette. Pokhlyobkin's approach to culinary history was nothing short of revolutionary. He saw cuisine not as a mere collection of recipes, but as a crucial historical source that reflected economic development, political processes, and cultural exchanges between peoples. Each dish, in his hands, became a silent witness of its era. Each ingredient became a key to understanding ancient trade routes, and each cooking technique an indicator of technological progress. But do you know why intelligent people sometimes do foolish things? In 1961, the scholar submitted to the Academic Council of the Institute of History the topic of his doctoral dissertation on the history of Soviet-Finnish relations. However, his colleagues greeted this initiative with icy indifference. The conflict had been brewing for a long time. Pokhlyobkin spoke too often and too critically about the work of the Institute, openly accusing his colleagues of bureaucracy and formalism. In the stagnant academic environment, such behavior was seen as a flagrant violation of subordination. The young scholar, who had been through the war and was used to speaking the truth to people's faces, simply could not tolerate the suffocating academic routine. He openly criticized the leadership for their formal approach to science, his colleagues for their lack of creative initiative, and the entire system for suppressing any independent thought. In the closed and conservative community of the Institute, such frankness was perceived as a defiant challenge. In 1963, the 39-year-old scholar made a decision that many of his colleagues considered sheer madness. He submitted a letter of resignation and left the institute, setting off into free sailing as a freelance author for popular publications. His colleagues unanimously claimed this was career suicide. In the Soviet system, full-fledged scholarly work was only possible within official state institutions. But Pokhlyobkin was ready to make any sacrifice to earn the right to study what truly fascinated him. This departure into independence turned out to be incredibly fruitful for his creativity. Freed from academic restrictions and bureaucratic chains, he was able to fully focus on the study of culinary history, the field that would become the work of his entire life. In the mid-60s, his captivating articles on tea, kvass, bread, porridges, and shchi began to appear in the popular magazine Ogonyok and the newspaper Nedelya. Before Pokhlyobkin, such topics were almost never raised in Soviet publications, as they were considered unserious. Readers, with unconcealed delight, learned that borscht had an ancient history, that porridge had been the foundation of the Russian diet for millennia, and that kvass had once replaced drinking water in most cities. Every article by this culinary historian read like a gripping detective investigation. The author did not merely present dry facts, but vividly demonstrated to the reader how he had arrived at them. People followed the course of his thoughts, watching as a clear and logical historical picture emerged from a heap of contradictory evidence. This was a fundamentally new way of popularizing science. Not a dull presentation of ready-made conclusions, but a lively and fascinating process of discovery. By the late 60s, William Vasilyevich Pokhlyobkin had become one of the brightest and most prominent figures in Soviet popular science journalism. His name was known to millions of readers. His articles were reprinted in regional newspapers, and colleagues in the field studied his innovative methods of working with historical sources. The man whom the academic system had rejected as an inconvenient truth-teller had won the unconditional recognition of the widest audience. But the most important achievements were still ahead. In 1968, his book Tea was published, a work that caused a true revolution in how millions of Soviet people viewed the culture of tea drinking. It was a manifesto of a new approach to the study of everyday history, turning its author into a living classic of culinary literature and opening the road to worldwide fame. Vodka War. In 1977, the office of the USSR Minister of Foreign Trade, Nikolai Semyonovich Potolichev, was gripped by near panic. Documents had landed on the minister's desk from the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And at first, their contents seemed like some kind of absurd joke. The government of the Polish People's Republic was officially challenging the right of the Soviet Union to use the name vodka for exporting its alcoholic beverages. Warsaw was seriously insisting that it was the Poles who had been the first in the world to produce the 40-degree grain spirit and, therefore, had the exclusive right to trade under this brand on the international market. Behind the dry legal language lurked an economic conflict of colossal proportions. The Polish state vodka monopoly demanded that priority in the invention of vodka be recognized as belonging to the lands of the former Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. According to Warsaw's statement, vodka had been invented and began production on those territories as early as 1540. Whereas in the Russian Empire, they claimed, production of the drink allegedly began only in the 10th century. The situation was rapidly escalating into a major political and economic crisis. Some Western countries had already imposed restrictions on the import of Soviet alcoholic beverages, citing Polish claims. Exports of Stolichnaya, Moskovskaya Osobaya, Ruskaya, and Pshenichnaya plummeted, costing the USSR millions of rubles in foreign currency every month. The country's prestige on the international stage was under serious threat. In this critical situation, the Soviet leadership turned to the academic community for help. The initial investigation was entrusted to two major research centers: the Institute of History of the USSR Academy of Sciences and the All-Union Scientific Research Institute of the Food Industry. However, both respected institutions sent back formal replies, effectively refusing to conduct any serious research work. Academicians considered the topic unworthy of their lofty scientific status. And that was when Minister Potolichev remembered William Pokhlyobkin, the only specialist in the USSR on the history of cuisine, whose works had already gained international recognition. For an author who was a staunch teetotaler and had devoted his life to the study of tea, this offer might have seemed paradoxical. But the scholar instantly understood the magnitude of the problem. This was not just about commercial interests, but about defending the national dignity of Russia. By special decree of the USSR Council of Ministers, Pokhlyobkin was granted unprecedented access to classified archives, including the holdings of the Central State Archive of Ancient Acts. For the first time in many decades, a private researcher was allowed to work with documents that even staff members of academic institutes could not access. A real race against time began. The International Arbitration Court demanded convincing evidence within the shortest possible time frame. By the spring of 1979, the research was completed. Pokhlyobkin had spent only a year and a half on the project, but performed truly titanic work. He studied hundreds of archival documents from the 10th and 11th centuries, analyzed linguistic data in 6 languages, and compared technological processes from different eras. The result exceeded even the boldest expectations of those who commissioned the work. The researcher applied a fundamentally new methodology. Since traditional documentary sources on medieval distillation were practically non-existent, he took a completely unorthodox approach. He conducted his analysis through the study of distilling terminology, the etymology of the word vodka, and the historical conditions necessary for such a product to appear. Such an interdisciplinary approach was unprecedented in Soviet historical science. Pokhlyobkin paid special attention to linguistic analysis. He convincingly demonstrated that the very word vodka has purely Russian origins, being a diminutive form of the word voda, water, with a suffix typical of the Russian language. In Polish, the term appeared much later and was a direct borrowing from Russian. These etymological findings became one of the key arguments in favor of Russia's priority. Equally important was the technological analysis. The researcher established that the technology of distilling grain spirit was known in the Muscovite state no later than 1478, and indirect evidence pointed to an even earlier date, sometime between 1431 and 1448. Meanwhile, according to Poland's own historical sources, the production of vodka there began only in the early 16th century. In 1982, the International Arbitration Court in The Hague issued a historic ruling. The Soviet Union was unconditionally granted priority rights for the production and export of vodka as a Russian national drink. Moreover, the court secured for the USSR the exclusive right to use the advertising slogan, "Only vodka from Russia is genuine Russian vodka." The victory was complete and final. For Pokhlyobkin, this victory became a true triumph of his scholarly methodology. He clearly demonstrated that meticulous study of sources, an interdisciplinary approach, and rigorous analysis could establish historical truth even in the most tangled and politically charged disputes. The methods he had honed while researching culinary history proved to be fully applicable even in international legal proceedings of the highest level. After such a triumph at the International Arbitration Court, Pokhlyobkin could have easily stopped there and rested on the laurels of a state-recognized expert. However, his scientific integrity demanded that he bring his research to its full ideological conclusion. The book that blew up the country. Over the next 10 years, he continued painstaking work on an expanded version of the History of Vodka, which was to become a monumental study of the history of Russian distillation. In 1991, as the political situation in the country changed dramatically, the researcher decided to publish his work for the general public. The book, The History of Vodka, was released at a critical moment in Russian history, the year of the USSR's collapse, and had the effect of a bomb exploding. But what if that bomb destroyed not only false myths, but also the author himself? For the first time, Soviet readers learned about the vodka war with Poland, the decisive role of science in defending national interests, and the deep historical roots of Russian alcohol culture. The book instantly became a bestseller. The first print run sold out in just a few weeks, after which unauthorized reprints and underground distribution spread across the country. In 1992, the work was translated into English and published in London. Western media began talking about vodka wars between Russia and Poland, while experts all over the world debated the credibility of the Soviet historians' conclusions. International recognition soon followed. In 1993, Pokhlyobkin was awarded the prestigious International Langhe Sereta Prize, conferred by an international jury of culinary experts from England, France, Germany, and Italy, for outstanding works on the history of food. It was an unambiguous acknowledgement of the researcher's achievements by the global academic community and, in a sense, a moral rehabilitation of the scholar who had long been ignored by the Soviet academic establishment. The Langhe Sereta Prize is informally considered the Nobel Prize of culinary history, and receiving it meant that Pokhlyobkin's work was recognized as exemplary, both in terms of scientific methodology and practical significance. For an author whom the Soviet academic system had dismissed as a mere popularizer, this was a complete moral victory. However, the History of Vodka made Pokhlyobkin not only world-famous, but also an extremely controversial figure. Critics began accusing him of bias, of tailoring facts to fit predetermined political conclusions, and of insufficient documentary evidence for some of his key arguments. Polish historians published several counter-studies attempting to refute the Russian version of vodka's origins. The criticism from professional historians around the world was especially painful for him. They pointed out that many of the medieval documents Pokhlyobkin cited had either not survived to the present day or had highly questionable attribution. Some of his interpretations of old Russian texts seemed overly stretched in their view, and his linguistic arguments raised serious concerns among specialists in historical philology. Modern researchers questioned Pokhlyobkin's central conclusions. In their opinion, the author treated historical sources too freely, presenting unproven hypotheses as established facts and deliberately ignoring evidence that contradicted his concept. Some critics outright called The History of Vodka a pseudo-scientific fabrication created for political purposes. But Pokhlyobkin did not give in to criticism. He continued to steadfastly defend his version of the origin of vodka, engaged in fierce polemics with opponents, and sought ever-new arguments in favor of Russia's priority. For him, this was not just an academic discussion, but a genuine struggle for historical justice and national honor. The researcher sincerely believed he was defending Russia's dignity from attempts to distort its true history. In subsequent editions of the book, the author supplemented the text with new material, clarified controversial wording, and gave detailed responses to critical remarks. Each new edition became increasingly well-argued and rich in documentation. Pokhlyobkin did not want to give his critics even the slightest reason to accuse him of scholarly dishonesty. By the mid-90s, passion surrounding the history of vodka had grown so intense that its author began receiving both letters of gratitude from patriotic readers and anonymous threats from his opponents. The book had become a symbol of a much broader debate about Russia's place in world history, its contribution to civilization, and the right of the Russian people to their own historical memory. For some, Pokhlyobkin was a national hero. For others, a dangerous mythmaker. The fame of the vodka historian opened new horizons for him. He was invited to international conferences in Europe and America. Leading publishers around the world collaborated with him, and foreign scholars studied his methods. But it was this very worldwide fame that made Pokhlyobkin a vulnerable target. The greater his fame grew, the more envy and hostility appeared around him. Criticism of his work became increasingly venomous. Academic debates gradually escalated into personal attacks. The man who had spent his entire life seeking historical truth had himself become the subject of fierce disputes and political speculation. In the last years of his life, the scholar increasingly complained to friends and acquaintances about strange phone calls, surveillance, and even attempts to break into his apartment. He suspected that someone wanted to seize his unique archive or destroy compromising materials. His close friends dismissed these fears as the paranoia of an aging man. But the tragic events of March 2000 proved that the old scholar's fears were more than justified. Are you ready to learn the truth that will shock you? The most serious blow to the scholar's reputation came from Russian writer and journalist Boris Rodionov. In 2013, he published a book titled Truth and Lies about Russian vodka, in which he made truly sensational accusations. According to Rodionov, no international arbitration between the USSR and Poland ever took place in the late 70s. The entire story of the vodka war had been invented from start to finish by Pokhlyobkin himself. As his key witness, Rodionov cited Boris Seglin, who in the 70s headed the legal department of Soyuz Ploto import. According to Seglin, the Poles had indeed raised objections to Soviet vodka advertising, but the matter was settled through diplomatic negotiations only. The USSR agreed to change the advertising slogan, but there had been no court case in The Hague whatsoever. If these accusations were true, it meant that Pokhlyobkin's greatest achievement had been a grandiose hoax. By that time, Pokhlyobkin himself was no longer alive and could not respond to such serious accusations. The disputes over the legacy of the culinary historian continue to this day. Some researchers believe that Rodionov was right, and that the vodka war was a fabrication designed to boost Pokhlyobkin's own authority. Others point out that the absence of documents about the arbitration could be explained by the secrecy surrounding such cases. A third group suggests that the dispute did indeed take place, but it was more diplomatic than judicial in nature. Regardless of whether the vodka war was reality or myth, the controversy remained. The history of vodka brought Pokhlyobkin not only fame, but also many enemies. Polish alcohol producers saw him as the chief ideologue behind Russia's claims to the vodka market, while Western companies were eager to discredit the Russian version of the drink's origins. But an even greater threat came from Russian criminal groups, which in the 90s were fighting fiercely for control of the lucrative alcohol business. In his final years, the historian more and more often received strange offers from unfamiliar people. He was approached by representatives of shady firms, collectors willing to pay enormous sums for his archive, and anonymous figures proposing collaboration. Pokhlyobkin categorically rejected all these offers, and that refusal may well have sealed his fate. Last months of life. In 1997, an event shook the 74-year-old scholar's mental health. His only close friend, his neighbor, Ivan Nikitich Staronenkov, passed away. After his friend's death, the historian fully withdrew into himself and became a true recluse. The apartment on the 4th floor of the Podolsk building became his fortress. He installed extra locks, hung several chains on the door, and stopped opening it even to the postman. Gradually, he became convinced that shadowy forces were watching him, intent on seizing his archive. He told the few visitors he still saw about strange men lingering near his building, suspicious phone calls at night, and attempts to enter his apartment through the balcony. Those around him dismissed these complaints as symptoms of age-related paranoia. Pokhlyobkin was especially troubled by the materials for his last book, The Great Pseudonym, devoted to the biography of Joseph Stalin. In this work, he applied his favored method of linguistic analysis to study the origins of the Soviet dictator's pseudonym. And the conclusions turned out to be so sensational that they could interest many different political forces. The book was explosive. It angered Stalinists and anti-Stalinists alike, Westernizers and patriots alike. In the politically unstable climate of the 90s, such a work could bring serious trouble to its author. By the late 90s, the scholar's paranoia had reached a critical point. He was firmly convinced that his phone was tapped, that his apartment was searched in his absence, and he even acquired a homemade shiv for self-defense. In 1998, an incident occurred that finally convinced him the threat was real. Returning home from the library, he discovered traces of tampering on his door locks. Inside, the apartment was in slight disarray, though nothing had been stolen. The scholar was certain that someone had been looking for specific documents. After that, he almost stopped leaving the house. Pokhlyobkin devoted the last months of his life to completing the great pseudonym and working on his monumental cuisine of the century. The winter of 1999 into 2000 became a time of agonizing premonitions for 76-year-old William Pokhlyobkin. A man who had been a rationalist all his life suddenly began to speak of dark forces following his every step. The apartment on Oktyabrski Avenue in Podolsk had turned into a besieged fortress. He was especially troubled by the materials on Stalin. In the great pseudonym, Pokhlyobkin put forward an alternative version of the origin of Stalin's surname, one that touched on sensitive questions about the dictator's national origins and personal life. In the politically unstable climate of the late 90s, such a publication could have caused enormous trouble. At the same time, the scholar was working on Cuisine of the Century, in which he intended to reveal who had systematically destroyed Russia's food culture and how. He was also preparing another volume of his reference work, Foreign Policy of Russia, and the USSR over 1,000 years, which was to be titled Tatars and Rus and would offer an alternative interpretation of the Mongol yoke period. Judging by his notes, he planned to radically revise traditional views on the relationship between Rus and the Golden Horde. In January 2000, the incident with the attempted break-in finally convinced the historian that the threat was real. After that, he almost completely stopped leaving the house, becoming a recluse who feared even his own shadow. The only person Pokhlyobkin still trusted was the publisher Boris Pasternak. It was with him that he discussed the plans for publishing his unfinished works. In February 2000, the manuscript of the great pseudonym was delivered to the publishing house. Pasternak, shaken by its contents, decided to publish it in a limited edition. But even that decision caused him serious concern. On March 22, 2000, William Vasilievich Pokhlyobkin left his Podolsk fortress for the last time to discuss the details of the publication in Moscow. The meeting at the publishing house went in a businesslike manner, and despite his fears, the scholar appeared calm and focused. After finishing his business, He went, as usual, to Kursky railway station to return home to Podolsk. It was his last encounter with living people. What happened after he returned to his apartment remains a mystery. None of the neighbors heard screams or sounds of struggle. The killer acted quietly and professionally. For the next 3 weeks, no one was alarmed by the scholar's absence. Everyone was accustomed to his reclusive lifestyle. It was only Boris Pasternak who raised the alarm when Pokhlyobkin failed to appear for a scheduled meeting. On April 13, 2000, the publisher finally persuaded the police to break open the locks on the apartment door. When the door yielded, a suffocating smell of decomposition struck them. On the bedroom floor lay the owner's body, dressed in that same formal suit. Green flies swarmed over the decomposing corpse, and the gas oven had been burning for 3 weeks. The forensic expert counted 11 stab wounds. But the most shocking detail was the toxicological report. The victim's blood contained alcohol equivalent to half a liter of strong spirits. For a man who had never consumed alcohol, this could mean only one thing. He was either forced to drink or the alcohol had been introduced into his body after death. Either way, it looked like someone's sadistic mockery. The state of the apartment completely ruled out the version of a robbery. All valuables were untouched. However, the rooms were in disarray, as if a search had been conducted. The perpetrator had either been voluntarily let in or had gained entry with keys, something that seemed highly unlikely given Pokhlyobkin's extreme suspicion. The evidence was scarce, but symbolic. A footprint from a size 46 boot, a cigarette butt from a Bellamore Papyrosa, and a clear print of the same boot on a copy of The Great Pseudonym. It was as if the killer had deliberately trampled the book about Stalin, and perhaps that book was the very reason for Pokhlyobkin's death. On April 13, 2000, a criminal case for premeditated murder was opened. An experienced investigator was assigned to the case, but it proved to be one of the most difficult in his career. All standard versions collapsed under scrutiny. It was clear that the killer had acted according to a carefully planned scenario, knew the victim, and was familiar with his habits. However, establishing the motive turned out to be extremely difficult. Too many powerful forces could have had an interest in the death of the author of the History of Vodka and the Great Pseudonym. On April 15th, William Vasilyevich Pokhlyobkin was buried at Moscow's Golovinsky Cemetery next to his father's grave. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. Everyone understood that a man of unique erudition, the last encyclopedist of the Soviet era, had passed away. The investigation continued for a year and a half, but yielded no results. There were no witnesses, and the physical evidence led to no concrete suspect. On October 22, 2001, the criminal case was officially suspended. The murder of William Pokhlyobkin remained unsolved, entering history as one of the most notorious crimes committed against Russian cultural figures. The man who had spent his life solving the riddles of the past had himself become the greatest riddle for future generations. 25 years have passed since the tragic death of William Pokhlyobkin. Yet the mystery of his murder remains one of the most puzzling pages of Russian criminal history. Every year, new versions of the crime appear online. Enthusiasts re-examine the case materials, and journalists attempt to find clues that investigators might have missed. The murder of the 76-year-old culinary historian has become a kind of historical detective story that captures the imagination of thousands of people. The public could not reconcile itself to the fact that the murder of such a prominent figure remained unsolved. There was a strong impression that someone influential had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. Priceless manuscripts disappeared, materials for the continuation of his reference work, Foreign Policy of Rus, with its alternative interpretation of the Mongol yoke, as well as additional documents for the expanded edition of the History of Vodka, which were meant to refute his critics. The disappearance of these materials gave his detractors reason to claim that the author had begun doubting his own conclusions, and that the scholar's reputation suffered even after his death. The mystery of William Pokhlyobkin's murder will most likely never be definitively solved. But this very unsolved mystery has become an integral part of the legend of the man who turned the study of culinary history into an exact science. The story of the great detective of history ended as a detective story without a resolution. Final chapter. The life of William Vasilievich Pokhlyobkin ended just like his last book, at the most intriguing point. The man who spent his entire life solving the riddles of the past became the greatest riddle for future generations. Who needed to kill an old scholar who sought only the truth? Why did the investigation reach a dead end? And why did the priceless manuscripts vanish? And have we really learned the full truth about his final days? Or are the most important pages of this story still hidden? Perhaps the mystery of Pokhlyobkin's death will never be uncovered. But it is precisely this mystery that makes his figure even more legendary. If you want to learn about other stories that still stir the imagination, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. New investigations lie ahead that will give you goosebumps.